Coming up on ReFramed. Along with this week's special guest, Sam Drummond. Today we'll be discussing the film Everybody Hates Johan.
If it happened in the US or Australia, we would have highlighted it as this is a disability film.
His aunt's like, yeah, well, we're all a little bit blown up, aren't we?
There's something like a little disabled doesn't mean much in the big picture. And I'm like, I just don't know how I feel about that.
You know, people would shout out at the bar or out of their car, oh, look, it's Mini-Me. And you know, that those roles define people.
Welcome back to ReFramed, the podcast that reframes how disability is portrayed in film and TV. I'm your host, Jason Climo, and today I have Robin Lambert with me as my co-host, along with this week's special guest, Sam Drummond. Today we'll be discussing the film Everybody Hates Johan. But before we do, let's say hello to Sam and learn a little bit more about them. So welcome to the podcast, Sam. Did you want to just start off by telling us all a bit about you and what you do?
Yeah, thanks for having me on the program. So I am a lawyer and author and have worked a lot in media. So I mostly radio and community radio and commercial radio, and also at the ABC for a little bit, and have moved on to use my actual training, which is discrimination law, discrimination and human rights law, and also wrote this book, which is Broke. And Broke is about growing up with a disability in a small country town in a non-traditional family, which essentially is why I chose this film. Because even though the film that we're going to talk about is set as far away as you can get without before you start coming back, it's got a lot of those themes coming through it. The small country town, people with difference, all sorts of strange relationship dynamics. And so I managed to get that into a book, and then I saw a film with similar things. So I'm really excited for this chat.
Love it. It was a very interesting watch, and I'm excited to dissect it.
So it sounds like you've had quite a extensive background in the media, like you said, working for ABC and a few other organizations. But why do you think it's particularly important to have representation in front of the camera, behind the camera, and in the media?
Yeah, so growing up, I didn't see. It's wrong to say that I didn't see any representation of me. I have a form of dwarfism, and there's plenty media representations of people with dwarfism around, but they're so often portrayed as very simple characters, simple emotions. Snow White, Seven Dwarfs each have one emotion, one aspect, and so there's not complex characters. I think the first movie I ever saw was Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and then there's all these strange orange-faced people over there, over the other side of the chocolate river from the humans, and quite misunderstood, I guess. No, there's no real interaction between people and people with dwarfism. You know, that is what I saw as a young kid, and then as a teenager along came Mini-Me. So here was this hypersexualized character. I'd come from watching characters who were these single emotion and very non-sexual beings, I suppose, to this hypersexualized, non-verbal, non-really thinking, just a follower, and that followed me around for the next couple of decades, I reckon. You know, people would shout out at the bar or out of their car, oh, look, it's Mini-Me, and you know, that those roles define people. They don't just stop at the actor that you see in the film or on the TV screen. They define every single person who might look remotely like that or remind people of that. And it's only in the last few years that we've seen that started to change. And I think a really big thing was Game of Thrones and Peter Dinklage, where there's this really complicated character, not a good character really, but has his positives and negatives, and is flawed, but also is the hero in some respects. And so suddenly you start getting this nuance, and people start seeing me as a nuanced person. That's my experience. And I think people with different disabilities have slightly different perspectives because their disabilities are seen differently. But the more representation that we have, the more acceptance that we have. And I think for myself, I got into radio after I left school, and it was almost hiding myself because I got to get behind a microphone, and people who are listening behind at the other end were hearing this Australian accent that's somewhere between a country Victorian accent and a Melbourne accent. And that's where what I was being judged on, and the content of my words. And it wasn't, I haven't done a lot of TV, but I've done a little bit. And that was a really big step as well, because suddenly I was visible, and perhaps not as noticeable as some other disabilities, but still, putting myself out there, and TV likes to do cutaways where I'm walking down the street, but I'm also hiding behind the desk. And the other thing I'd say about that is that when I was in radio, I didn't, I had this sort of accent of the vast majority of people in our community. And that can be even harder for someone who might come from a migrant community with a disability, and they wouldn't be able to hide like I did. So all of this is like step by step, me revealing myself and saying, hey, this is me and I'm proud of myself. And you can judge me by the content of my words and not by those media representations that you've all grown up with.
As well, like what you've just shared is such a, like, I want to say this in a way that actually makes sense for listeners, but it's a really obvious example, like such a clear example of how media representation over time getting better has actually changed people's experiences in real life in the community. And I was really excited to talk to you about this, and I'm like glad that you brought up those examples of like Oompa Loompas and Mini Me, because over time, it has improved. It's still so far to go, as we'll discuss. But you know, I'm sure when you were younger, as you've said, like people would probably just point at you and assume, or just, I don't know whether it's teasing. I think adults should know better, and they probably are pointing at you teasing. But kids, like, they don't know better, and so if the only example that they have seen of someone that looks like you is, you know, one of the seven dwarves, like they're going to just click straight away in their brain without even really thinking much more about it and go like, oh, there's Grumpy or something. Like, do you know what I mean? Whereas now, like what you've said, like when you've got those big productions like Game of Thrones, there's Peter Dinklage, like amazing, like complex characters, breaking down all those stereotypes, awesome. And then that trickles down into kind of like the everyday sort of representation in, you know, programs like Play School. That's where like the actual real community impact happens. You know, things like Game of Thrones, I think impacts people of kind of like our age and above. So, you know, like 20s and above, like people that actually watch those shows. Yep, sure. But it's the kids. Like I find like kids programs and kids films and kids shows, when they do disability representation right, I just get like pumped. Like I'm like, yes, like this generation is just growing up without so much of the crap that our heads were filled with in terms of what disability looks like, what disability is, what people with disability are capable of, like all of that.
That's the importance of media, because I see it. My daughter's in 3-year-old kinder right now, and this is the time to open their worlds up to diversity. And whether that's people of different genders or people from different racial backgrounds or cultural backgrounds, religious backgrounds, and disability. And I'm really lucky to live in a multicultural community and people from all walks of life. But I see it. I saw it at the start of the year when I'd go into the room, and these 3 and 4 year olds would come up to me and say, "Why are you so small? Why, I'm nearly your height. Are you really a grown up? Are you make believe?" Or whatever they might say. And there's a really simple answer to that, and I'm hearing it more and more in the community. It's taken me years to work out the variations of, well, everyone's different, and it would be really boring if we're all the same. Not everybody is lucky enough to have that diversity within their own communities. And the only way that we can get that acceptance is through broad media, whether that be mainstream media or the internet or books. And there are these really, really good resources now where you can search out for diversity, and you can search out those TV shows or kids' films or books that have done a really great job at diversity. And suddenly it's normalized for those kids, and they just want to play. They want to play in the sandpit with you. And once they play in the sandpit with you, then you know you've succeeded. When you know that things haven't gone right is when there's a 7 or 8 year old and they start, I guess, really laying it on thick and not accepting an answer of, yeah, but we're all different, because they haven't been able to ask those questions yet. And once they get to 7 or 8, those views start getting entrenched, and you can see the 17 or 18-year-old at the bar or with their P plates winding down their windows, yelling at people down the streets. Like, we have to get this young, and film and media is the way to do that on a broad scale.
Okay, well, now I think it's time to talk about our film for today, which I'm excited. I feel confused. There's so many conflicting feelings. Loved it. It was actually, anyway, we'll talk more. But Robin, before we get into analysing it, can you just give us a bit of a rundown of Everybody Hates Johan?
Yeah, so the movie follows this guy called Johan. He's a little bit of an oddball, a bit of a loner in his small town. He grew up in this family that was like sort of famous for blowing things up, because they used to blow up bridges and to keep the Nazis out of the Germans out of the town. And like because of that, he's got this like affinity for dynamite. And anyway, it ends up that his friend Solvor, they try and blow something up and it goes a bit wrong, and obviously she ends up with disability. She's an amputee and a wheelchair user and has some facial difference, and this just makes his community hate him even more. So he leaves and goes to America, and then the film really follows him 15 years later when he comes back to the town, and then sort of trying to rekindle this relationship with Solvor.
Yeah, it was a really interesting one. I can't remember the last time I watched like a Scandi type film like this. It was actually so fun, and when you first suggested it, Sam, I was like, oh my god. I'll be honest, I was like, is this really going to work? And then looked into it more, and then we obviously had that conversation, Sam, where I was like, is there actually disability representation in here? I can't find like anybody talking about this. And you're like, yeah, there is, stick with it. And then I was like, right.
I think that was really interesting. Nobody's talked about this from a disability perspective, but it's for me, that was a key part of the whole film. But if you look at the reviews, they won't even mention it, or they might mention an accident in passing.
Do you think like maybe it's a bit like disability erasure, or that it's just like so like they're a bit more normalizing disability, for lack of a better term, that than sort of what we would in Australia and the US and the UK, that they just don't feel the necessity to like mention
Yeah,
it?
perhaps that's right. That it was just so incidental to the story from their perspective, that if it happened in the US or Australia, we would have highlighted it as this is a disability film. Well, this is why I like Scandi cinema, is because, as you said, like there are so many conflicting thoughts that you have, and it's not neatly packaged. Scandinavian cinema don't like a neat ending or even a neat storyline. And I think that was really clear here, including in the disability representation. I think one of the first things we need to get out of the way is that Solvor, the person who acquires a disability, the love interest of Johan, is played by, I think, 3 different actors. There was an opportunity to cast an actor with disability to play her as an adult, and they missed it. So it loses points straight away on that. But then it's portraying Solvor. I'm going to get to Johan in a little bit as well. But you mentioned that there are 2 things. Solvor acquires 2 disabilities through the explosion, and one is facial difference, and one is she becomes an amputee and uses a wheelchair. And I think in a small town, there's this risk of the small town locking her up, or putting her away and saying there's the person with the disability. I see her role as actually her locking herself up, and that the townsfolk don't actually do that to her. They are quite accepting of her. And we see that through their relationship as well. She's Johan very much wants a relationship with Solvor, and she is saying, I wrote down a quote that she said, that I've never liked you and you're not my type.
She is savage.
Yeah. But you think that there's still some sort of spark there, but she is trying to let him down, I think because she's protecting herself. And there's such complicated things around disability and relationships, particularly when there's someone without a disability and someone with a disability in the relationship, and you try and work out whether that's creating a power dynamic. And I think Solvor actually creates a power dynamic where she has the power, and I think that's really good and a real win. But I also feel sad that these are meant to be life partners, and she's turning herself away from that because she thinks there's some sort of, I think deep inside, and this is what I got, maybe you have a different interpretation, but she thinks there's some sort of deficit, and she's protecting herself from that deficit or something like that.
I fully agree with you, and this is why I had so many conflicting feelings, because there was like moments, and you pretty much, like, I feel like really explained quite eloquently what I had written down in my notes of like, how am I going to explain this? Like this, I've got so many conflicting thoughts. I think you've actually just explained it so eloquently, so well done. But yeah, there were moments where I was like, okay, cool. Like she's not this, desperate person where anybody who shows her any interest, she's like, oh yes, please, because we've seen that before as well. She's also not needing to be saved, which is what I also liked. Like Johan isn't coming back to like rescue her from anything. And like you've said, she actually is in a position where she has the power in the relationship, and she does deny him many times, and she's pretty savage about it, which is actually quite entertaining to see as well. But then exactly like you said, like I feel like she has this really strong internalized ableism. And I think that was the thing that I noticed throughout all of it, is that actually the only kind of main form of ableism that I noticed in the film was her own internalized ableism. Nobody else gave a shit.
Johan has a conversation with his aunt at one point where he's like, I don't care what happened, like I still love her, and his aunt's like, yeah, well, we're all a little bit blown up, aren't we? Like we've all got like our own things going on. So that's like, yeah, a pretty interesting way of looking at it, I guess. But
and that parenting, I think, because the mum is the only one who seems to have any qualms about, except for Solvor, who seems to internalize it possibly from her own mum. That's reality, right? We see parents putting their own stamp on disability all the time in our community.
There was one part that I just really don't know how I feel about it. Sam, I hope you kind of remember this part. But at one stage, Johan's father figure, and I've forgotten his name, he says something like, a little disabled doesn't mean much in the big picture. And I'm like, I just don't know how I feel about that. Because I'm like, okay, I get what the sentiment is that in the grand scheme of life, disability doesn't mean that much. It shouldn't be the reason why you don't love someone or whatever. But it still almost makes me feel like it's something that is in the cons column. You love someone despite their disability. And so I just don't know, but maybe I've taken that the wrong way. Do you remember that moment?
Yeah, I think you're right. There's an opportunity, and many opportunities in the film, to just say Solvor is whole and complete, just however she is. They fell in love as teenagers, happened to get blown up, but a lot of people get blown up in the film, and and that you can, her disability is part of who that is, and you see Johan loving her disability, really, despite this supposed wisdom from some of the elders in the film.
One thing that I also thought was maybe not great about, I guess, Solvor's disability representation throughout, and more than happy to debate this, so feel free. But as much as it was almost incidental in some way, in terms of no one really made a huge deal about it, her experience of disability, other than maybe her mum, I feel like it also almost was a plot tool, and almost only just a plot tool to create conflict between Solvor and Johan, and also more conflict between the community and Johan.
I think even with neurodiversity too, sometimes people, like you said, think differently or act differently, and everyone's oh, they're weird, and then they sort of try and find those reasons not to like someone as well, because you can't just say, well, I don't like them because they're a bit odd,
yeah,
as well, in real life.
Yeah, I suppose, and that kind of builds into this theme of almost a really strange representation of neurodiversity, if that's what it is, where he's just this really othered, different thing. It's time to give our scores out of 5 on our completely made up inclusive disability representation scale. So, Sam, what did you give Everybody Hates Johan?
Look, I would have loved to give it a higher score, but I think I just can't make my mind up either way. And so I would have given it 3.5 if the actor of Solvor was disabled. But that took it down a notch, and so I'm right in the middle at 2.5, because there's good and bad. And I just can't resolve those two.
I feel you. Robin?
Yeah, I gave it 2, because I was just confused, but also just confused by the whole movie. So I was I don't feel like I'm fully getting out of this what I should, perhaps.
But I think maybe that's the point.
There was some nice moments.
Yeah. I fully agree with you, Sam. If the actress who played Solvor was disabled, as an adult was disabled, then I reckon I probably would have almost been up a 3.5, 4, because there was really good moments. And I sometimes think maybe it doesn't all need to be spelled out and wrapped up in a really neat bow for us, and we can think about this more. But yeah, I was down at a 2 pretty much because of that. I just think the representation, anytime, especially something traumatic as well, I just think it's really icky for me, especially when it's a traumatic event that causes disability. Probably somebody who has that same experience. I just really dislike it quite a lot when it's a non-disabled person playing that. And I'm like,
it's like the first step. Like,
yeah, like I'm like, a non-disabled person is never really going to be able to portray disability and the feelings that are involved in that and the emotions correctly, but especially when there's like trauma, I think, involved. So,
and it's not like there was such an opportunity of 15 years. Like it's not like one of those movies where you see a car crash and the person who was walking before suddenly is in a wheelchair. An opportunity there where you just hire an actor with a disability.
like what you said, like we didn't actually see whether or not Solvor was alive until we actually see her next, which is when she is already disabled. So it's like there was actually this real opportunity to go, let's hire an actress that is disabled. So yeah, but anyway, it was a really interesting watch. I'm glad you chose it because I would never have watched that on my own, to be honest.
Thanks for coming on the journey with me. I do recommend people watch it.
Me too, and also, yeah, I guess that's where we're at now. Is like this. That's it for this week's episode. We really do want to hear everybody else's thoughts, so do go watch Everybody Hates Johan. It's on SBS On Demand at the moment, and enjoy that journey of watching that because it is an interesting one. But once you have watched it, please do let us know, like on social media, or you can also email us. On social media, you can find us if you just look up ReFramed Podcast or Podcast ReFramed on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So if you want to post in the comments or just post wherever you like, tag us in your thoughts, all of that jazz. And you can email us at hello@reframed.com. And yeah, before we sign off, I want to say a huge thank you to the Community Broadcast Foundation for helping to fund this series. And I also want to say a huge thank you to you, Sam, for joining us. Everybody should go check out his new book. And obviously thank you as well to Robin for being my co-host on this episode. Thanks again. Bye. This has been a production of Attitude Foundation.